It's not listed in our worship folder. It didn't show up online, so sorry to the if anybody is watching online. I didn't get this material posted. I talked last week a little bit about I was kind of on the fence. Do we want to talk more about divine call information? Um, and that's the direction I ended up going. And I was trying to just figure out, I maybe made the final decision about 2 hours ago. Um, no decision there, but as far as how, because of course I had materials printed for Romans, because you had those last week, and figured I had to make sure I had something useful if we were actually going to discuss the call. I had to think about it a bit. You can trust me, I did a lot of thinking and a lot of talking about it over the course of the last week. I also had a few things that were maybe challenging as far as getting things done, like an air conditioner repairman who was at my house for a long time just the other day. And so, some things that just kind of disrupt the schedule. And so when I thought last week, like, oh, here are some times that I'll have to plan and sit down and think about these things, well, they kind of went away. And so thankfully, you did arrive here pretty early this morning and had a chance to work through and at least organize some thoughts. I've got plenty of things that I could say and plenty of things that we could talk about, or at least you could hear me talk about. But I'd rather that we kind of talk together about some things. And so trying to figure out how to set this up that would encourage us to do that. And this is what I came up with. It's just 2 pages, but 2 pages can last us a while. So um, let's talk about the concept, and then we'll offer a prayer, and then we'll kind of work through the page. So right at the top, you see the concept, and this is a quote from, I have the paper right here. Uh, Richard Gergel is now president of Martin Luther College. Uh, I had him as a seminary professor, and I believe that would have been his role at the time of this paper. He presented it in 2008 to the Michigan District Circuit Pastors, plural, meeting. That was at Livonia, Michigan, January 31st, 2008. I don't remember how it first came to my attention, but I am very thankful for the fact that a lot of papers that professors and other pastors have prepared are available online. The online seminary essay file is a really excellent resource. And it's hard to really rank things this way, but this is one of my absolute favorite papers that I've ever read, because I found it very practical, very useful, very helpful on just thinking about things, considering things. How do we approach certain things? And so, only shared one paragraph here, but I brought the whole paper in case there were things that I wanted to reference and share with you at other times. This is pretty early in the paper. In fact, it's a chunk of the second paragraph, and it says this: yes, in the process of deliberation, God promises that his good and gracious will is at work for the sake of his church. Church, further defined this way, for both his sheep and their shepherds. Yet at the same time, God has also equipped his public ministers with the privilege of exercising sanctified reason in coming to a decision between two equally good and valid divine calls. And now this has a long title on the paper. The short title is "After Much Prayerful Consideration, ... Right? The ... is pretty important in that title. The longer title is The Interrelation of Sanctified Reason and God's Will in Deliberating a Divine Call. Now, not everybody would get as excited about that long title as I do, because it is a lot of words and a lot of words that we don't always use to. I don't know that I've ever said until just now interrelation. But perhaps, and it can be a useful word, a useful concept. Do we get the idea here? The first paragraph of this paper says, "Is the length of our lives fixed and determined by God, or is it influenced by the decisions we make in the course of our lives?" Yes, that is the correct answer. And it's exactly the answer that Professor Gergel gives. And then he says, like, we, our puny minds, can't stick those things together and say, how does this work? We can kind of, claw at it a little bit and say, sure, God takes into account and uses and operates within the decisions that he also allows us to make. And so you can make decisions about what you eat and how you exercise. And we can look, I kind of like the way he phrases this. Whichever recent study about what is harmful to our health will prove to be correct this time. Right? We don't always know if we hear the headlines and try to figure this out. Like, well, what does make sense for me to do? So you've got those two principles of God has given us reason, allowed us to make decisions about how we conduct our lives, with the implication that that does have an effect on our lives. And he also, makes us promises like Psalm 139:16. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. And so, how those truths fit together is kind of a challenging, I think fun, certainly interesting thing to think about. How does this work? So, that's the example from other experience that we then say, okay, the same thing is true about a divine call. God's will and God working and God accomplishing those things, and people like a pastor who has received a call thinking, using sanctified reason in order to come to a final decision. There's a whole lot packed into that paragraph. And I'm hoping that we can take a little time unpacking some of it, thinking about some of it, commenting on some of it. And of course, we have a particular circumstance that we get to point to right now and say, hey, we can apply some of these thoughts to a very specific question. Let's ask God to bless that process as we get going. Dear Lord, our Heavenly Father, we thank you for your good and gracious gifts to us, that you promise to accomplish your will, not only in this realm, but in all things, and that you have given us the blessing of reason that we can use in a sanctified manner. And we pray that you would help us all to do that throughout our lives, and that specifically you would be with us as we study this topic and as we work towards a decision in this particular call. We pray that you would bless both congregations involved and all of us according to your good and gracious promises in Jesus. Amen. Do you have any questions about that opening paragraph or anything that you would like to either ask about, clarify, maybe just say, I found this particularly interesting and I didn't think about it before? I don't want to move on too quickly, please.
Well, the same thing as you said, the person who receives the call, the same thing happens at the congregation or the voters meeting when they
Sure.
this list, and God has His will for that, and now can they decipher what that will is?
I've had some conversations with this guy about some of these matters too in the past. If you didn't hear, it's not just about the pastor deliberating, but some of you may remember call meetings, and you get a list and you try to figure out. Um, a couple of things that I would like to say. One, this paragraph says, okay, and we're previewing what comes next, right? I have a call to a church called Grace here in Southern Arizona, and I have another call that's recently been extended to a church called Grace in South St. Paul, Minnesota. Um, they went through that process, right? And so those two, Professor Gergel calls that two equally good and valid divine calls. In other words, there's not a decision that in and of itself must be the wrong decision and therefore a sinful decision. Um, and therefore also a right and a God pleasing decision. And we can apply a lot of that thinking also to the process of calling a pastor. Would it be sinful if they had called a different pastor on their list as opposed to me? We'd be very careful not to say that. Um, and then at the same time, acknowledge when they extend the call, they in confidence and us also we can say, this is a divine call. And that's part of what's meant valid, divine. These are important factors. And the paper also deals a little bit with, if you're convinced that this call is not valid, right? Somebody was not cooperating in the system, didn't seem to be like, you kind of can dismiss that and say, no, this is not the proper, channels and so on. But that's a separate question we're really not planning on spending a lot of time on. Um, and so that's a big part of the discussion is we don't want to give ourselves or anyone else the impression there's a right answer and you got to figure it out, right? It's broader than that. It's more complicated than that. Kathy. Did you peek ahead at the next page already? Yeah, probably. No, Kathy's getting right to the point of this idea of there's always so much that we could say about these things, and about the way that God uses them and the way that God blesses the process and accomplishes His will in a variety of ways. And so, one to emphasize out of there, um, just the the things that this does for different people involved. I like the way, again, Professor Gergel said, for the sake of his church, both for his sheep and their shepherds. Right? I mean, that means pastors and the members of the congregation. And, even more complex things that pastors are members of the congregation, but they also have some unique roles. And so the point is God accomplishing his will in the whole picture and throughout the whole process and in all sorts of different ways. And I hope we'll get to talking about a little bit more of, maybe some particulars that we might think of how that might happen or how that might come about. Any other questions or comments just on the opening and the concept here? Yeah, please.
My very first call meeting, which I was not receiving but it's a meeting at the congregation and the district president was there. His name was Carl Ross, I recommend the Northern Wisconsin district. And he simply came and said to us, he said, you need to remember that God has already chosen who your next pastor is going to be. It's just up to you figure out who that is.
Yeah. let me also say, part of Gergel's paper, and after much prayerful consideration, that sounds like the letter that announces a decision. It's a phrase a lot of pastors use. Um, some of the paper is this idea of, do pastors speak carefully enough that they give the right impressions and they avoid giving the wrong impressions? And so even there, I there is a point and there's also a danger, right? There is a point to, um, of course, God knows what's going to happen. God accomplishes his purposes. He has chosen the next pastor in any particular situation. Um, we could pull out even further and say, of course, we don't know. Maybe this any congregation may not have a pastor until Jesus comes back, which could be today, tomorrow, anytime, right? So there's always more complexity that we could at least think about. And then just that idea, if we say, you've just got to figure it out. It's not about the right answer. It's as much about the process as it is about getting to that point. Bob, please. It's a good time to give it a shot. Yeah. Right. Again, I'm not going to begin to imagine that I know what God considers, other than he's way beyond all of us and our combined knowledge. But the idea of, are there different approaches that we ought to take? Are there different ways? And so a specific example here where, yeah, we have partnered with two congregations that existed before they were part of Grace, in addition to starting a second place on our own, like that, we can say all the same things. We did a lot of work and a lot of thinking and a lot of praying about that. That doesn't mean that this was the way, like if we had chosen something else, God would have been disappointed in us, or the other way around. Because we did this thing, it was necessarily the right answer. And so we just always have to balance that. And what are the things that we can say? God has accomplished his good purposes in all sorts of lives in the life of his church through those things that were done. And then we just want to be careful not to say too much more than that. We could point to some specifics, and that's also useful, as opposed to just, saying this, which follows along exactly with we don't want to give the impression that we know more about God's will than we actually know. We know as much of God's will as he has told us, right? And then we know that he accomplishes his will even in things that he hasn't specifically spoken to us about. And that's why this can be a good and good. So just keeping that kind of framework in mind, I think will be useful. So that we can talk to some specifics, let me introduce you at least briefly to Grace Lutheran Church in South St. Paul, Minnesota. Sunday, July 27th, some of you have heard this already, 10:30 our time. My phone rang. It was in my pocket, and so I quickly tried to make sure that it wasn't going to make too much noise. I was sitting in a pew. I had been up front for part of the service, and I was sitting by my family at that part. President of the congregation, along with the vacancy pastor and circuit pastor, they're the same guy, were giving me a phone call, left me a voicemail message, which shared the fact that they had a meeting, that they were calling. they realized, oh, the 2-hour time difference probably explains why you did not pick up the phone, and kind of went from there. So, a few things I've learned since then. The church was founded in 1920, so they're just over 105 years old as a congregation. The church building was built, current church building, in 1928, which makes it older than that one right there. The position, pastor, has been vacant since January 1st, 2024, when the previous pastor retired. So that puts it at about a year and a half of calling for a pastor, little bit longer than that now, and working through this process. They are calling just for one pastor of that congregation, not one of multiple, not multi-site, those sorts of things. Just some statistics. As of the end of 2024, they reported 236 members, 166 communicant members, and 81 as an average weekly worship attendance. Really quickly grabbed some numbers this morning because I don't always see these numbers split out because, of course, we do consider 4 sites as far as, but this is Grace Tucson. This is this location. We mark 185 people as members of Grace who primarily worship here. Of that, 173 is communicant members. Now, that number went down over the last month. We had several transfers out that happened in the last month at our last ministry board meeting. That being the biggest difference between the previous report. 173 communicants, 130-ish weekly. I would try to give you a pretty current number, so that's about the last. Last Sunday, which was the first Sunday of August, all of July, and maybe I looked a little bit at June. It's summer numbers, which means it's maybe a little lower than a year-long number, which is the comparable for South St. Paul would be a year-long. But just to at least kind of plug in some ideas that we have, some rough estimates. Some of the differences. Suburban blue-collar neighborhood adjacent to St. Paul. It works out that South St. Paul is generally south of St. Paul. Some of St. Paul is east of South St. Paul. There's a river that kind of cuts on one side of South St. Paul. West St. Paul is immediately west, not of St. Paul, but of South St. Paul. And then where I grew up from the age of 10 in Inver Grove Heights is directly south of West St. Paul, and part of it is adjacent to South St. Paul. That's all Twin Cities metropolitan area, and so on. But blue collar was something I actually was kind of talking about just yesterday. But they kind of consider themselves a tight-knit community, even though it's a part of a massive 3.7 million people metro area. Crown of Life Lutheran Church is pretty close by. That's where the circuit pastor and vacancy pastor, same guy, so where he is. They have 2 sites, and I didn't double check the borders of Eagan, Minnesota. That's where their second site is. Their first site, or one of their sites, is in West St. Paul. Crown of Life operates an elementary school, and it is close as Grace South St. Paul is to St. Croix Lutheran Academy. St. Croix Lutheran Academy now has grades 6 through 12. I went to St. Croix Lutheran High School. It did not have grades 6, 7, and 8 at the time. I went there for 9 through 12 and then graduated from there. So that's a bit of detail about what they're looking at, what they're thinking about. Would you like to take a moment to ask any questions about this? Yes, please, Sean. Thank you. um, I'm very careful about calling anything a sign, and I have Professor Gurgle backing me up on that, um, where he wants to remind us all that one of the things God speaks to us about is, not to expect him to speak apart from his word. Oh, yeah, there it is. It is still true that it is the mark of a wicked and adulterous generation that seeks after a sign. Matthew 16, verse 4. Here too, we live under the cross and walk by faith and not by sight. Um, I felt attacked, so now Sean feels attacked. uh, the point being, really, and think of the context there. People are asking Jesus, give us a sign that you're the right guy, the guy that we should be looking for. And of course, he's given plenty of signs. Um, and he is talking to people who reject. And so neither Professor Gurgle nor I are painting with such a broad brush that we start calling believers the wicked and adulterous generation. Really, it's focusing on the sign. Be careful about what you think is telling and what you understand is not. Um, I've had somebody request already that the fact that I had an air conditioner repairman at my house also not be taken as a sign for deciding how this divine call is decided. So, Kathy, please. We're all going to pray together again after this, right? Can we do that? Yeah, fine question. Um, so, yeah, the question was how this congregation's needs are being met since they're looking for a pastor, just a single pastor, and they do not have a pastor. Um, there are two pastors at Crown of Life, and the vacancy pastor, the circuit pastor, is Pastor Com, and um, whichever of the pastors is not preaching at Crown of Life, I'm not even going to try to explain how he explained to me the pattern goes of which pastors go to which places at which time. But I will say this much. The pastor who preached last week will preach that same sermon this week at the other church, not the other sites, but the other church, so the vacancy sites. So they have some meetings and so on, and also the lay people at Grace Lutheran Church South St. Paul are working on what are the sorts of things we need to be thinking about doing, planning, um, for both when we have a pastor and uh, are being served in this vacancy process. And so I think we can think about, well, we've got kind of a combination of things. Pastor Kohler and I both serve primarily at this location. And then, of course, we have other pastors involved in the multi site. You remember maybe when we were calling for the position that ultimately Pastor Shoreline accepted. I would spend one day a week at the office in Savano, and was regularly rotating out, but that we also involved our other pastors in a rotation to serve the place. And so some of that, of course, is built in, but it's also not exactly the plan. So it's also not as simple as just saying, well, we've got two pastors, they've got none. Seems like a good average should be one, so let's do the math on that. It's not just a math problem, right? Um, if that's hopefully helpful. Yep.
I'm guessing that if you get to a real binding, any number of pastors at St. Croix Academy also will go for a Sunday and preach.
I am aware of a pastor who is employed, called by St. Croix Lutheran Academy, who's also serving a vacancy. I believe that was Pilgrim in Minneapolis being served in that way. And so, yeah, also some additional resources. Years ago, Pastor Hollemeyer would regularly, show up in the pulpit in Lent and sometimes Advent, and doesn't do that as much, but just another way that pastoral help is afforded in different circumstances and situations. Gary.
I think you previously said something about the last several pastors there were in their retirement years. There seems to be a pretty big difference between the member and the worship. Is that because of no pastor recently, or do you think maybe it's previous trends?
Kind of like our which is it? The answer is yes. Apparently, membership numbers declining is a trend over 10 years. And that was something I specifically asked the circuit pastor, vacancy pastor yesterday, if he could share some information with me about that. Weekly worship is actually a slight uptick from 2023 to 2024, which is a neat thing to see that this sort of, what are members doing to kind of step up and help out, that they have been actively encouraging each other to faithful church membership. So let's talk a little bit about the process. I think let's run through all of the steps and then look at some of the individual questions that I put down. So prayer is a big part of it, and thus the title of the other paper, After Much Prayerful Consideration. I just jotted down a note that we really ought not pray that God would directly reveal something that he's not promised to reveal. This idea of suggesting that a pastor has a better way of conversing with God because I get to ask questions like this and God gives me answers. It doesn't work that way. God speaks to all of us through his word. That is his promise. Prayer goes the other direction. We speak to God. It's useful not to confuse those two things. Jeffrey, did you have a question here? Okay. Yeah. So blue collar is a reference to more like labor-oriented work, as opposed to being in an office. This white collar that I have on conveniently identifies me as someone who doesn't do a whole lot, like as far as my job with moving things or carrying things or using physical tools, as opposed to talking to people and phone calls and work on the computer and so on. So that's really our blue collar is physical work. So thank you for asking. But yeah, that those involved, right? We're asking that God would do what he says, that he would bless this whole process. We're asking God that he would do what he says and give us wisdom, give us patience, give us love, help us to think about the needs of others, not just ourselves, all sorts of things kind of summed up in a sanctified matter. Discussion, I already said, I talked to somebody yesterday. I tried having a couple additional discussions. Was that yesterday or was that Friday? Maybe both. And not all of them worked out. So still having some. Not a lot of detail on that one because I was kind of going to leave it up to our discussion. Who should we talk to and so on. And then deliberation. Now, deliberation can certainly begin before discussion has ended and is going to be kind of mixed in the process, but kind of pulling that out as another step to say, just thinking about the differences, identifying those things between the two calls, that's a very useful kind of starting point. But then the second part is pretty important. How does that fit? If you look at those differences and say, well, what about my strengths? What about my weaknesses? What about the things that I do well? What about the things that I do less well or not well at all? How does that work? What about personalities? What about particular time or circumstance? All sorts of useful things that's kind of blanket and generic ways of talking about. We would maybe hope to get at some specifics, and then finally a decision, and the pastor gets to make the decision and inform people about it. And so we have a pretty formal list of whatever decision is made. I would write a letter and I would send it to my district president. I won't send it to my circuit pastor because I'm the circuit pastor of this area, but I'll send it to that district president and that circuit pastor, and I would send it to the congregation at the attention of the president, who was the one who first notified me of the divine call. So that kind of covers all the bases for the people who really ought to know. And our president is probably over there going, I'd like to know this too. And he'd be high on that list as well, in that process. And then, ministry board, then also the rest of the congregation. And you've kind of seen that in Friday emails and announcements at church, and those sorts of things too. Um, if you accept a divine call, that's the start of a lot of planning and a lot of putting together some moving pieces. Obviously, if you decline a divine call, that leaves a lot to what was coming before. Like, they would likely keep going through the process of extending another divine call, and this call is still one that I would be serving. Um, an important passage also, Romans 11. Hey, some Romans for us, right? Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments, how untraceable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his advisor? Quoting there from Isaiah. Just to see, hey, this is a complex question, and we're not going to fully answer it to our satisfaction. This interrelation of wisdom, of sanctified reason and God's will. But you notice 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bullet points that I skipped over that have particular questions. You have 7 minutes. Actually, it's getting really close to 6 minutes. I guess that math works out pretty well. You have 1 minute on each question. No, let's just do it this way. Please, please, please read through them, and you decide which one you would like to talk about next. And if you come up with a different idea, it's going to kind of be the first hand that I see gets to pick one and start answering it, and we'll decide whether we keep on that one or go to something different. Eric. Yeah, thank you for that. You have some experience. I was trying to take a look for. Yeah, there it is. 1 hour, 1 minute. That was the phone call that I had with the president of that congregation Sunday afternoon. And yeah, you could add another minute because of the voicemail. So, um, uh, I this question really came to mind. I had a hour and a half, hour 45-minute drive. It was just me and Naomi, and she said, "Dad, um, what kind of things do you ask people when you have a phone call like that?" And, "Oh, okay, that's a good question." And so tried to think of some of the things that I had asked and had answered. Um, any questions that come up as you start reading through the material and the things that they want to know about, some of the things that you've already asked, church attendance, membership, seeming to be on the decline, maybe any reasons that you can identify there. Um, and then I would just point you to when I said strengths and weaknesses, personality, time, circumstances. I think those are the big umbrella things. You just try to get an idea of it. Um, and then I would also say discussions. Just it's useful for a pastor to not say, "Well, I'm really good at this sanctified reason thing, so I'm just going to figure it out." We've got lots of partnerships with lots of people, and so to use the collective wisdom of a whole bunch of people. Um, anybody you want to mention on the top of the page too, like with whom ought these conversations take place?
I just want to go back to what do
Okay.
pastors ask. So I once had a pastor that we had called contact me, and I had known this pastor when we were kids.
Okay.
We had gone to the same grade school and stuff as we were growing up. And he wanted to know if I had put his name on the list. Nope.
which could be feeling out that part of, is this part of the process? Did the district president put that in place? And rather than feeling that maybe it was kind of a side door or a different thing. I think sometimes that's useful information about. Honestly, one of my favorite questions to ask is if you were at the meeting at which I was called, was there something specific that people saw in my biography that lent to that being the thing that pushed them in that direction? Because then I get to kind of gauge, like, are they seeing it the same way that I'm seeing it? Are they looking at what I've identified as strengths and weaknesses the same way as I really feel about strengths and weaknesses? Please. The strengths and weaknesses part, as far as another congregation seeing it, is the pastor himself. So there's a whole bunch of things that the synod asks you to basically rank, like 1 to 5. I think it's 1 to 5. It's either 1 to 5. It's been a little while since I've done it. I have an email that I'm sitting on, like, you should do it again. Um, and so, the fact that it's self-assessment means you got to read a little into. We encourage uh, pastors to at least run it by circuit pastors and have a conversation about it. That there's not any obvious, but at least you would see. Oh, and it's both ability and interest that are ranked. So, I'm sure I'm pretty high on Bible study, like adult Bible study, as an interest, as an ability, and that really does reflect on things that people have shared with me. Um, and so if somebody's, yeah, like, we want to beef up our Bible studies, that maybe would be something that they'd identify and I'd say, oh yeah, that's a good fit, as opposed to maybe some of the other things that um, you know I enjoy youth ministry. I don't know that I'm looking for a call that's pretty exclusive to that right now. That maybe doesn't have the same appeal that it maybe once did for me. So just that's different time, different circumstances also. Oh man. One of them. One of them. Really quickly, one of the things that made the decision for me is I just don't know how many Sundays we'd have to chat about these things. Um, we do have different people here. We have had some of these conversations in the past. I thought this one was approached a little bit differently, hopefully in a way that's kind of useful. We didn't even get to Kathy's. How might the call process affect both congregations, even in the case of a decision to decline? And I do have a hope and anticipation that as we look at maybe what are the strengths and weaknesses of our congregation, that maybe helps us to think, going forward, maybe we can engage on some of those things. Whether it's, oh, I found a new way that I could step in and volunteer, or something that I could contribute, or just taking a good reminder, like, hey, being in church and Bible study on a very consistent and regular basis really is important and appreciated by more than just one person or the pastor, or because those are some of the things that definitely come to mind. So that being said, I appreciate this discussion. If you would like to pick something out and grab me later and say, can we talk about this a little bit more? I put the questions together, so I'm happy to talk about them, and have given them some thought. So keep that in mind too. Thanks for staying a couple extra minutes, and I'll see many of you over in church shortly. Balance is one of my favorite words in connection with this whole process. Because, yes, right. That's maybe not enough of looking at it. And I don't like, if you're talking about my parents, that's different than talking about my kids, right? And so, like, my parents moved here, yes, they appreciate me.
What do you know, Robert? How